Uh, Hello everyone. This is in continuation with our exercise where we're trying to get different thoughts regarding what to expect from the budget and what the wish list is from that different experts have on from the upcoming budget. And today, we are joined by a very special guest who needs no introduction. He has been at the helm of affairs of managing India's economic policy since all major crises, right from the balance of payment till the 2008-9 crisis. Montek sir has served, as the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, and he was also the first founding director of the Independent Evaluation Office before that of the International Monetary Fund. Thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us, sir. I want to begin with talking about reforms in general. And the reason I want to begin by talking about reforms is that since a major part of your work has actually been to push for a lot of these reforms and shift the focus away from what was the erstwhile policy that India adopted towards economic policy making. So what are some of your reflections about the past, including the pandemic and its impact across the world? How do you view the challenges and the resulting economic impact that we are facing at the moment across the world, and in specifically with respect to India?
The discussion on reforms is a continuing discussion because you never stop reforming. Any economy over time faces new challenges, and as it faces new challenges, it has to respond to those challenges. And those responses mean changing policies. And that's usually called reform. So I think the general definition of reform is what is the change in policies that you've actually brought about. Now, I won't go into all the past reforms. You specifically talked about the COVID pandemic and what is the current situation that we face. Now, it's quite clear that the COVID pandemic has been a major adverse effect for the whole world, not just for India. It's kind of an unprecedented pandemic in one sense. Certainly, we haven't seen anything like it since the Spanish flu, which was more than 100 years ago. And it has had a very negative effect on GDP across the world. There's a lot of talk also that the pandemic may change things in the future. And I think we'll come to that a little bit. But right now, the position as far as the pandemic is concerned is that uh, we have obviously a very large number of infections. That is to some extent a reflection of the size of the population. I mean, if India had the same percentage infection rate as other countries, we would have a huge number of people affected. I think that we clearly the such data that we have, and there's a problem with all data in this area, suggests that the pandemic is easing off, in the
Hmm.
sense that the number of new cases seems to be falling, which is a good thing. Uh, but at the same time, there's a lot of concern around the world that this is no proof that you won't have a second spike. It's also no proof that you won't have a mutant variety which comes back in, and you're seeing some of that in some countries. So I think we are in a position where things could have been much worse, but certainly we can't sit back and say everything is over. One good news is that in India, as in many other countries, a large vaccination program has started. We don't know how effective vaccinations will be, but clearly it has to be one of the important positive developments in the current situation. And let's hope. I mean, if we actually succeed in vaccinating 700 million people over the next year and a half, that'll be a major achievement. And hopefully it will bring some respite. What about the economy? Well, I think as far as the economy is concerned, I mean, you all know the facts. We had a big hit in the first quarter of the current financial year with GDP falling by 24%. I think it was the largest fall in any other country. No other country had such a big fall. Since then, the economy has been recovering from a very low level, but I don't think it has gone back. Even now, it's not back to normal. And the other thing is that, the impact has been different for both different sectors and maybe different classes of the population. I mean, obviously, some sectors have been very badly affected, what they call the touch sectors, services, hotels, restaurants, travel. These have been very badly affected. Manufacturing seems to be coming back, but within it, it's the formal sector that seems to be recovering. The informal sector is quite badly hit. And you saw that also on the employment side, because a lot of loss of employment, mainly informal sector employment, people who had come in from rural areas suddenly finding they had no income support. I mean, in a way, it revealed the fact that we were running an economy in which a lot of people could become suddenly vulnerable.
Hmm.
And you had this mass migration back, etc. Uh, very difficult circumstances that we faced. The latest projections that we have are that we are going to see a contraction of 7.7% in GDP in the current year. Basically, in the first half, there was a contraction of almost 15%, and 7.7% really means that in the second half, they expect to see no contraction. In other words, we get back
Yeah.
maybe to what we were in 2019-20. So, looking ahead, what can we see as important and what needs to be done? Well, one thing is very clear that, I mean, we are going to have a budget in another week or so, a little more than a week. And the finance minister has said that this is going to be a budget like no other. Now, one sense, of course, she's right, because we've never had a budget following a 7.7% contraction. But she's also said she wants to make India a leader of growth in the world, sort of a positive, upbeat signal. I do think it's a good idea that the government is trying to commit itself to achieving something positive. You do need a positive message at this point. But I would say that we should not focus too much on what is going to happen next year, because that's just a recovery. I mean, if the GDP next year, which means 21-22, if the GDP in 21-22 goes back to what it was in 2019-20, then since it contracted by 7.7% this year, you may get a growth rate of 8% next year. I wouldn't count that as a big achievement. Although obviously, when it happens, I mean, governments have a right to say, well, we're seeing growth, but that's really only getting back to square one. The real challenge is, what are we going to see after we've got back to the 2019-20 GDP? Now, here you have a big problem because the economy was slowing down even when it entered the pandemic. I mean, in the last full year, the growth rate was around 4.2%, and it had been decelerating. So, depending on how many years you take,
Yeah.
you could say the economy was between 4 and 5%, let us say, as it entered the pandemic. Now, the question is, it will get out of the pandemic. I think we've done a certain amount of fiscal, certain amount of stimulus, a lot of monetary stimulus, a little bit of fiscal stimulus. Maybe we do a little more in the current year, which we should. I mean, I personally think that at this point, the finance minister should not be too worried about spending. We should spend to get the economy back on track and then try to get the fiscal position into a more stable situation over the next 3 or 4 years. Okay? But what is the growth rate that we are targeting? It cannot be between 4 and 5%. I mean, that will be a real disaster. I think, I hope, and I have no idea what the budget is going to say, but I hope that the budget sets a target that we are going to do now the sorts of things that will lead to a growth rate in the year 22-23, which gets close to 7%. Okay. Next year's growth is going to be good. And I mean, I think she has a big advantage in being able to look at that without too much effort. Okay. So what is it that you need to get a more sustainable, longer term revival in the growth process? Well, if you look at, there's a lot of agreement on this across economists. I mean, most economists will tell you that in order to grow, and the growth is ultimately going to be private sector led. I mean, if you think you want a public sector led growth process, that's a different ballgame.
Yes.
But if you want a private sector led growth process, then what you need to do is to massively improve the macroeconomic balance in the system, which actually means bring the fiscal deficit down to a reasonable level. That's one set of things. The second is you've got to do a lot of reforms that will increase productivity, increase the incentive to invest, be supportive of private investment, etc. Because private investment has collapsed, and that's a really big problem. Now, my feeling is that in the coming budget, that is for the year 21-22, I don't think she will have to show what is the budget deficit in the current year, okay, and that's going to be huge because the uh, budget estimate for the deficit was about 3.5%.
Hmm.
That did not include some of the off-budget items which have been hidden under the carpet. And that if you bring them in, then the deficit was really around 4.5%. Actually, what has happened is that revenues have collapsed and the GDP is lower. So
Yeah.
the denominator is also lower.
Lol.
And the collapse of revenues obviously leads to higher deficit. Some increase in expenditure, which didn't happen in the first half of the year because I think the ministry held it back. But the finance minister has been saying that she's going to spend in the remaining parts of the year, which is the right thing to do. But we better be ready for a fiscal deficit, central fiscal deficit, somewhere between 7.5% and 8% of GDP. So my first wish would be that we should acknowledge this upfront. Let us not pussyfoot and hide it and so on. I don't think anyone will blame the finance minister for a big deficit this year because, after all, this is a once in 100-year pandemic.
Yeah.
I think she can actually say that, look, it's much higher than it should be, but it would have been wrong to try to retain the original target. Because to retain the original target when revenues have disappeared would mean contracting expenditure. And it would be crazy to contract expenditure when private consumption expenditure is down, investment is down, exports are uncertain. So we had to spend very big fiscal deficit. I'm aware of it. I don't think she'll be criticized for that. And by the way, most countries are running big deficits. Maybe not as big as ours, but countries differ. Second question is, what about next year? I don't think that she's going to be in a position, and I don't think she should try to show a huge improvement in the fiscal deficit next year, but there should be some improvement. I mean, if the central fiscal deficit is between 7.5% and 8% or so this year, let's try to improve it by at least 1 or maybe 1.5 percentage points for the next year, that is 21-22. Now, the big reason why you might be able to do that is essentially that you have a big rebound in revenues. I mean, if GDP is going to go back by a growth rate in real terms of 8%, and maybe with inflation it'll become 14%,
Yeah.
you should be able to get a big rebound on the
Yeah.
revenue front. And that combined with some modest um, revenue raising activity in the form of asset sales. We've several governments have talked about asset sales, and none of them have actually got around to doing it. And I think we need to recognize that if you really want to sell those assets, you need to make a strong political decision
Yeah.
that you're going to sell it and that you're not going to be bothered about accusations that you sold the family silver and this and that. I mean, successive governments have failed to bite that particular bullet.
If
So
I'm
if
not
you
mistaken, so the last asset sale happened in early 2000s.
Yes, I think the Vajpayee government was the last one that actually managed to do some asset sale. I mean, Arun Shuri was the minister concerned who managed to get it done. But then, even he ran into trouble with some of those things. So unfortunately, we are very vulnerable to anyone making an accusation that some garber has gone on.
Mm.
And since then, the whole asset sale thing has really petered out. There is a lot of scope for that, and I see from the newspapers that at least this government is talking about privatizing public sector enterprises. I think if they do that, that'll be a good thing. But we have to see what is actually done. I make a big difference between making announcements and actually getting them implemented. because it's very easy to make an announcement. I mean, we made an announcement we're going to sell Air India, but we haven't yet sold Air India. So some of these things are not even going to realize a lot of revenue because these are really loss-making enterprises. So the objective should be to get them off your back and let somebody else make some money and profit out of them.
Hmm.
But whatever it is, I think in the current coming year, the fiscal deficit should be better than in the current year, but not hugely better.
Yeah.
I think she needs to put in place a structure which shows that in the next 3 or 4 years we're really going to do a lot better. Now, what can she do to create credibility there? One is obviously asset sales, but the other, frankly, is also tax reform.
Hmm.
Now, here, my preferred choice, and many people have said this, there's nothing original in what I'm saying. I think the reform of the GST, fixing the problems of the GST, should have very high priority. Conceptually, as a reform, the GST is being universally regarded by economists as a good thing. And even this government and the previous government, I mean, they were all in favor of doing it. But I feel that the way it has got done has robbed it of the ability to mobilize resources. Now, I don't want to go into that at great length, but I would say that there are 3 or 4 things on which virtually all experts are agreed. We must bring more items that are not under the GST into the GST. We should reduce the number of rates to about 3. We should have a much smaller list of exemptions. At the moment, almost half the items in consumption are, this is just
Yeah.
ridiculous. We should have a uniform, moderate rate for most of the items. I would say 14% is probably good enough. Some people will say 15. At the upper end, we should have a smaller range of so-called luxury items where you can charge a higher rate. I mean, personally, I think 28% is too high. 24% rate is good enough. And that should not include intermediate goods. That should really include only final luxury consumption
Yeah.
items. So it will be a major reform. The trouble is, it's not something that she can do in the budget
Yeah.
because it can only be done by the GST
GST
Council.
Council.
But given that the government has a very large number of states which are really run by the ruling party, the BJP, I think if she were to make a statement that the government has decided that we are going to go to the GST Council with this reform, it would be a very good initiative. And I think markets would at least sense that the government is on the right track.
Yeah.
Then it becomes a matter of how do you convert that into a political reality.
Yeah.
But frankly, given the parliamentary strength of the present government, if they can't do it, then nobody else can do it.
Hmm.
So I would judge whether something is done on the GST. All the other stuff on tax reform is not, I think, very important.
Yeah.
I'm sure she has received hundreds of recommendations, raise this rate, raise the other rate. Frankly, I think in the longer run, we should get out of this business of fiddling with rates.
Yeah.
We should clean up the system the way it is now. And I think if she does that, it would be a very, very big step forward.
Step
I mean,
forward.
that's one point. Second point, which again for growth, you cannot have rapid growth if it is not supported by a banking system that is willing to lend efficiently to enterprises that have the capacity to grow. And I think we have to recognize that the banking system is in deep trouble. Now, I think we wasted too much time by sort of saying whose fault is it? Did it begin in the previous government? Things always build up over time. All governments inherit some problems. This is now 6 years of the present government. So I think the fact is that in those 6 years, we have not achieved the kind of banking reform that we needed. Okay, I would say that we should distinguish between mere slogans and what are we going to do. I think on the banking side, the biggest problem we face is that the banks have had very high NPAs, and those NPAs are now going to increase
Hmm.
thanks to COVID, because the moratorium that was
Yeah.
introduced, I mean, was a good thing. It helped delay things for firms, but it's not as if the delay has led at the moment to the kind of high growth that would lead these companies to actually be able to repay. So the chances are that a lot of the companies that have got a moratorium will end up with loans which are NPAs. Now, there will be pressure that no, we should extend the moratorium even further. I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, I'm not saying we should necessarily take penal action, but we should start counting the NPAs the way they are and start making provisions for them. And of course, try to see who can actually repay these
Yeah.
loans. Now, I think along the moment you do that and you have large NPAs and they have to start making provision for these NPAs, oops, hold on. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the moment you have these large NPAs, you will have to make provision. If you make provision, then it'll eat into your capital. And then you have a problem. Are you going to have regulatory forbearance in
Hmm.
the sense that you relax the requirement, or are you going to insist on capital adequacy? I think we should insist on capital adequacy. This will put a big pressure on the budget as far as public sector banks is concerned, unless the government is willing to privatize some of these banks. So I think the time has frankly come that we should privatize some of the public sector banks. Now, it's easy for an economist to say that. I mean, we have been saying it for a long time. I mean, it was first mentioned in the NDA government under Mr. Vajpayee when Yashwant Sinha said that I'm going to take the government share down to 31% or so, but there was an opposition within
Yeah.
the party. The Congress party has always been opposed to privatization of banks. Even the BJP seemed to have the same view. I don't know what the position is now. But from an economic point of view, I don't think it makes sense to insist that we are going to have a majority ownership. You can have as much say in the social role of the bank by having a 30%
Yeah.
the
So,
difference is that it no longer is a public sector enterprise, so it's no longer covered by the rules that apply for public sector enterprise, which is good. I mean, at the moment, I think the banks are too hampered by the kind of criteria that a public sector enterprise has to fulfill. So this is a very big decision, and if the government were to announce that we not privatizing everything, but we are going to privatize some banks, some public sector, it will be a major step forward. I would
interestingly, sir, there have been reports that the new privatization and disinvestment policy is actually viewing to privatize some of the banks. Now,
I've
whether it
seen those
happens or
reports.
not, whether
I
it
don't
happens or
know
not
whether
is a
uh,
separate issue. But I mean, there
yeah, but
does
these are
it
reports
will be
means your friends, the journalists, are saying that. I mean, I've not seen a government document, so maybe I'm wrong. I've seen,
some government officials have made statements to this effect.
yeah, but
Uh,
I think what has to be fair, unnamed. Very often in governments, what happens is that these ideas are there,
hmm,
and what the officials are saying is, we also believe this and we're trying. But ultimately, a policy is when the government, the cabinet approves a policy.
hmm,
Now, what is happening is that the budget, since the budget speech is read, every budget speech is cleared word by the prime minister. What a finance minister says in the budget speech is actually speaking for the prime minister because the prime minister has cleared everything.
hmm.
Okay? So I think if she were to say, yes, we've decided this, then it becomes a real policy. And if you fail to deliver on that, then you'll be criticized for
Yeah.
not delivering. These other statements, some committee has recommended something, some official, I don't think that amounts to a statement. Now,
Okay.
part of the point is that sometimes people hold back statements thinking, let's put it in the budget speech. Fair enough. I mean, it gets a lot of publicity. Not only it gets a lot of publicity, but it becomes a signal that the PM himself is supporting it. So we have to wait and see. I have no idea what she's going to say, but I do think that if she were to make that statement, that we are going to privatize a few banks, whether she mentions the banks or not, I think that would be a very major statement, be well received in the market that we're really trying to do something different. The other thing I would say is that, and this is to me, to my mind, very easy to do. There is no justification for the present system, and this has gone on in several, this is not this government's problem. This has been there for years, that the RBI does not have the same power over
Yeah.
public sector banks that it has over private sector banks. Now, this frankly is ridiculous. I mean, whatever power the RBI has on a private sector bank, it should have on a public sector. In a
Yeah.
private sector bank, if it feels that the top management is not fit, they can simply remove them. And they have removed some people in the private sector. They never do that in the government banks. Now, the reason they don't do that, they say, is that because the this appointment is made by the government. But a regulatory body, I mean, if you are a driver and you're employed by the government as a driver, but the regulator takes away your license, the government is free to pay you the salary, but you can't drive.
Yeah.
I think the RBI should be given exactly identical powers. That will also take away what is at present an excuse.
Hmm.
Because the RBI says, what can we do? We don't have all the power and so on. This is completely wrong. And this will require a legislative change, but they should do that. The third thing is, again, something which has been hanging around for quite some time, and that is the recommendation of the PJ Nayak committee that even for the public sector banks where you have a majority shareholding, don't hold it as government. Set up a holding company, let it be run by professionals brought in from the market, but not civil servants, but professionals, and let them constitute the board of the bank and let them give power to the boards of the banks to do whatever is necessary. This would basically take away the oversight which the
Hmm.
finance ministry has. Now, not surprisingly, this idea has been floated before. Finance ministry has never been willing to let go.
Yeah.
But I think we have to now recognize, and around the world, let me put it this way. We are a country now that likes to think of itself as being taken seriously in international markets. I can assure you that nobody in international markets thinks that the involvement of the finance ministry adds value. They just don't. So there's no particular reason why we should be doing this. So this is another critical reform
Yeah.
that could be. Finally, I would say that I'm a little concerned about some of the trends that have emerged recently. Raise customs duties in about 100 items. And I think this is a regressive step. Some people think that it is the logical consequence of Atma Nirbhar. I hope that that is not the intention. Uh, Government spokesmen have said that Atmanirbhar does not mean raising a protective wall, which, if they said that, that's good. Prime Minister has said that he wants India to be brought into global supply chains. I think that's also good. That's what we should do. But if those objectives are the objectives we are pursuing, then it doesn't make sense to raise customs duties. Because a global supply chain means that you should import wherever it can be produced efficiently, add value in that part of the process where you have competitive advantage, re-export the stuff. Now, in order to be well thought of as a potential partner, first of all, you need low duties and not high duties.
Hmm.
And secondly, you need procedures which are smooth. And I think we fall very low in any index of customs procedures, port clearance
Yeah.
procedures, etc. So I think port clearance procedures can be done, will take time. But I think we should have a clear declaration that, look, we are not going to be raising import duties. I think if she makes such a statement, it will reassure people. Here and there, if you pick a sector and you feel, I think it needs some protection, it's a different matter. But now for 3 years, we've raised over 100 items. And I think we've created an environment in which people think that if they can become more competitive by raising duties, they can lobby for that and the duties will be raised. And
Hmm.
that, I think, would be the wrong thing to do. I mean, we've had experience in the past of what those kinds of policies led to. And I don't think we want to repeat that.
No, thank you so much, sir, for your time and for your insights. We would, of course, love to hear more, but unfortunately, we are short of time, so we might not be able to ask some of the questions that we have on our mind. But we do hope that we will get another opportunity to talk to you, perhaps after the budget, so that we can explore, what the budget got right and what were some of the misses on the budget.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot.